Welcome to Hatfield House for the 9th Hatfield House Chamber Music Festival. Thanks to the glories of the virus, we've had to go viral, if that's the right word, this year. And we're extraordinarily grateful to everybody who's taken to this new form of festival with such enthusiasm and such skill. I hope that you'll enjoy our virtual festival this year and that we can go back to normal next year. One of the things that has been suggested is that as part of the performance that we should try and set the wonderful music that you're about to hear into context and the context of Hatfield House. The builder of this house was a busy politician. He followed his father as the most powerful man in England until his early death, mainly from overwork, I suspect, although it was really a form of cancer. He spent his time governing England, but he had other obsessions as well. He, of course, was passionate about architecture, but among the other arts, one of his other passions was music. So much so that he had his own set of musicians. The lutenist Cooper, who, according to the conventions of the time, corrupted his name to the more professional-sounding Cupraria. He commissioned, for instance, great composer Dowland, and he kept his set of musicians busy at Hatfield until his untimely death in 1612. So it might be of interest now that, thanks to the persuasiveness of Guy Johnston, that we are once again making Hatfield a centre for fine music. If we set the history of the house and some of its context, of its contents, in the context of what we're doing for the music festival, and help us through, in my own ignorance of the contents. We're very, very lucky indeed that Dr. Emily Burns has kindly come to help us discuss some of the works of art that the house contains. Perhaps I ought to say that, as one of my daughters is wont to remind me, we're not Chatsworth. We don't have any Rembrandts or classical great works of art. Our real treasure, of course, lies in our library and in our archive. But there are some interesting pictures, some of which have considerable relevance to the music that you are going to hear during the course of the festival. And Emily is very kindly going to help us talk about some of them and set them in the context of the history of the house, and I hope you'll enjoy it. Well, Emily, as you see, we're now in what we call the Marble Hall. Mm-hmm. In a way, a rather anachronistic room, I think, in the sense that if you look at the somewhat later Queen's House in Greenwich, which let in a complete architectural revolution, I think if you're a parvenu family like ours, you rather liked having a medieval hall, which implied that you were rather grander in descent than we actually were. And essentially it's what was always here. There was a much higher fireplace which was cut down by the Victorians, and the ceiling is original, except that it was done over in the 1870s by some Italians called Taldini. I think they did rather a good job. But the rest of it is pretty well as was. The cupboard is the only bit of furniture we know which survives from the great palace at Tibbles, which was built by the great Lord Burleigh, the father of the builder of this house, and I think it's one of the few things, apart from some pictures, that he brought with him. But of course, the thing that we really want to talk about here is the rainbow portrait, which is one of the famous pictures we do have of Queen Elizabeth I, and you know a great deal more about it than I do, I think.
Well, this is, of course, one of the most famous portraits of Elizabeth I. So because of its name, it's called the Rainbow Portrait. You can't quite see the rainbow anymore because over the course of time, the pigments have faded and changed colour. And so the original brightness is now really held by her amazing gown, which is covered in quite an unusual pattern of eyes and ears, which is on the one hand said to represent her great fame. She's of course a great propagandist, and there are many portraits of her and many writings and sonnets to her. She very much encouraged this. But on the other hand, it's possibly not too subtle reference to her being the eyes and ears of the country, the nation, and of course her spy network headed by Walsingham. So it's a sort of not so subtle hint at how she has knowledge beyond the immediate surrounds of the room she's standing in. She is actually this is around 1600 this was painted, and she's actually in her 60s at this time. So not really as she appears in this picture. And Sir Roy Strong once called this the mask of youth that she essentially cultivated towards the end of her 45-year time of reign. She's got flowing locks like a virgin. You know, people would wear that before they were married. And of course she cultivated this image of her as being a pure and untainted virgin, married only to her nation and to God. And that's supported by the pearls she adorns herself with, a sign of purity. And then also we have this beautifully intricate coiled snake with a sphere on top, which is a reference to wisdom and intelligence. So that paired with the eyes and ears is her intelligence network, which decorates her dress. And
of course, spies were necessary, weren't they? Because
absolutely.
After the papal bull of 1570, Regnans in Excelsis, if you were a Roman Catholic, you had to choose between your faith and loyalty to the Queen. And things really got serious after that. Hence, effectively, the great tradition of English spy mastery was born there. It was beginning before in the reign of Henry VIII, I think, but Burleigh and Walsingham were, as you say, were the great masters. And of course we had this, I've always thought this was really about her.
It's all about her.
It's all about her, isn't it? Non sine soliaris, she's the sun, there's the rainbow, there's no rainbow without the sun. So gross piece of flattery. Yeah,
and she's also in a sort of mask costume. You know, this isn't just state dress or court dress, this is fancy dress. And she and the other Tudor monarchs, and also the Stuart monarchs, were great fans of the court mask, of dress-up. Yeah. And it suggested that she might be the moon goddess, which again is paralleled with a theme of purity. And there's a sort of slight Diana, the crescent sort of moon shining at the very top of her headdress is a reference to that. The artists of the day were actually employed consistently to decorate mask costumes, decorate the royal palaces, decorate the barges and the carriages. You know, if you were the court artist, you weren't just painting portraits such as this. You would be probably employed in many other ways, and taking likenesses was only one very small part of your job. So it's impressive that it's actually so good. It's been attributed in the past to Isaac Oliver, who's also a miniature painter. The attribution's often quite complicated with these sorts of pictures.
Who do you think it's by? Do you think it's by Gerrits the Younger?
I think Gerrits is a definite possibility. There are pros and cons to both, I think. But what you cannot deny is that it's an extremely powerful image of a very confident ruler at the end of her reign. Yes.
And of course, that hair was a wig, wasn't it?
Yep.
And that awful makeup, which no doubt poisoned her.
Yes, it had lead. To cover as a sort of foundation concealer, which apparently made your skin grey and shriveled, was the quotation that's recorded.
It didn't improve her complexion, whatever.
No, but here she is youthful and beautiful.
Which perhaps, in view of what you said about the power of the Queen, rather brings us to this picture, doesn't it?
Yes. So this picture is a fete at Bermondsey. And it has recently been reattributed to Marcus Gerrits the Elder. And this is for a number of reasons, but based on comparison to his own artwork, but also especially because of a tiny little inscription that is in the lower left corner here, which is on that little sort of rock that this boy lies across. And what seems to have happened is the picture was dedicated to someone and then given to the Cecils, and therefore they had to paint over the dedication and therefore lost the title of the artist, which after analysis and scanning and close looking, it was found that the name was Marcus Goetz, the Elder. And you can locate the picture because we have up here in the upper left the Tower of London. So this, believe it or not, is a scene from the South Bank of a wedding, a sort of almost like country wedding of sort of peasants dancing in the foreground, and this procession here on the left coming from a church, and possibly a self-portrait just of this man here leaning against a tree, looking back at the viewer with a very direct gaze if you look very closely. And this has been compared to images of Marcus, and it seems comparable to his likeness, which is very exciting.
There is a print I've seen which looks very like, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it is also therefore linked to this other picture, which you've bought to join as a pair, which is of a village festival. And so now you have two festival fete, sort of probably based around marriage processions.
So perhaps we better have a quick look at this one now you've mentioned it.
The other one. So whereas the fete can be clearly positioned opposite the Tower of London across the river, this one looks like it might have been based on a more generic countryside scene. It sort of has throwback to Bruegel's art of country peasants revelling and enjoying themselves with some rather kind of worn down country buildings and often a church nearby. It's likely that this was done by the Marcus Goetz workshop a little bit later than the fete, but it nonetheless has many very similar tropes and patterns that we can see repeated in terms of a few people's positions and little motifs and details that are recurring, which is quite fun. You can see he was partial to certain images.
If you look at all these different costumes, that you can tell what part of Northern Europe they come from. So there is another message in here as well. And he obviously very much enjoyed painting kitchens with spits and fire. And you can see the same pies there as you see in the other
a different kind of wedding cake to the one we're familiar with, but a wedding cake nonetheless, holding up different sprigs of herbs which all had symbolization that was linked to a marriage ceremony. But you're right about the costumes, and it seems that there was a link. The artist had seen images of European different national costumes by Lucas de Heer, and there exist drawings, and there are some very, very close costumes to these drawings. And in this picture, there was clearly,
I think,
clearly some understanding of the different dress. But you can see there's much variety. There's extremely fancy dress and also very sort of informal, more peasant outfits. But everyone's enjoying themselves, all in the same place.
Before we leave this room, there are a couple of other things perhaps we could talk about. That horse there, I always thought that he looked very like a horse in the Rijksmuseum wasn't there a great animal painter called Davies? And I got a letter from a PhD student a few years ago saying, well, of course, the guy never came to England, so it couldn't possibly be by him. It's on all the original inventories. But he said he did come to England, this chap discovered, and he came in 1594. So I said, oh, well,
interesting.
Do keep digging and let me know.
Yes. Well, I mean,
exciting.
By tradition, and some people say that this is, the white horse of Elizabeth I. Other people say that Burghley kept horses, and it was a particularly prized horse of his that he wanted to memorialise in portraiture. And it's a particularly good early example of a beautiful grey.
The only other thing perhaps there are a number of other things here which perhaps needn't detain us, is the 4 Napoleonic flags, these are reproductions, the real ones are upstairs, but Wellington conducted all his campaigns in the Hatfield Hunt coat. He sent his friend Salisbury 4 flags from Paris after the Battle of Waterloo, and these were 4 of the mustering flags. in the Champ de Mai, they mustered the army which was defeated at Waterloo by département, and these are four of the département flags. Right, well, that's the Marble Hall. Let's go upstairs to King James's drawing room. I suppose the staircase is one of the glories of the house. It's rather a showpiece. Early cantilever. It's not perhaps as engineeringly as solid as it should be. So large numbers of people have to hug the inside. And we've just, a few years ago, put in this red colour. The tapestries are sort of Brussels-ish 17th century, 1680s, and they're part of a much bigger set. There are about 40 or 50 of them.
Wow.
I mean, there really are a lot. And so we hung them on there, and then there are various artefacts here, partly booty from Omdurman and partly presents to Prime Minister Salisbury from South Sea Islanders. And we're in the process of learning a bit more about those artefacts, which apparently are rather beautiful. And some dog gates.
Stop the dogs running up the stairs.
Stop the dogs running up the stairs. That's a lot of the pictures here have been moved around because we're, by way of celebrating this year, the 500th anniversary of the great Lord Burleigh's birth. So we moved some pictures to make part of an exhibition. As the house isn't open because of the virus, we've left it there, and we hope that we'll do it next year. But that's a double picture, I think, put together of the two old boys, father and son. With their wands of office. And presumably after both of them were dead, do you suppose?
Yes, it seems to be the sort of combining of two established portraits, doesn't it? And they're tilted towards each other.
Yes.
As if a pendant portrait.
Right, let's go upstairs.
If I go on the right, will I fall through the stairs?
No, you won't. I think you can bear your weight.
That'll be a dramatic ending.
Now then, open the door. Well, we call this King James's drawing room, which was, I suppose, the main reception room of the house when it was built. It was built in a hurry, so you see there are slight failings in its design. And there's a sort of the line of route is a bit awkward.
Yeah.
Which I suppose reflects the hurry, but it's obviously always been a very grand room. Anyway, perhaps the star attraction here is this picture here, which I think is in the middle of being reattributed, isn't it, Emily?
Yes, I think so. I don't think any firm name has been put on it yet. It's been thought to be by Nicholas Hilliard, who is possibly better known as a miniaturist, although he did do full-scale works. But it, in many ways, doesn't really look like a Hilliard. And given that we have the date, which is on the sword, of 1585, and George Gower was sergeant painter from 1581, it's most likely that this is a Gower, although there are other contenders. So that's as much as we can say about the artist, but we can certainly say a lot about the picture itself.
Yeah.
Which is extremely exciting and a nice balance to the rainbow portrait that we just looked at. It is, of course, in comparison, much darker. The rainbow portrait's bright orange and bright because she's trying to be the sun and there's a rainbow. This one is a real contrast, a monochrome of sort of black and white to accentuate, firstly, the ermine, after which the picture is named, which was, the ermine fur was only to be worn by royalty and the high nobility. And this is because in the winter ermine would shed and become this beautiful white animal that was said to rather die than soil its fur. And they have wonderful little black tips on the tail, although this one seems to have little black tips all over it. So I think the artist didn't quite understand the concept of ermine. But this is in reference to her Elizabeth's purity, of course. She is also completely decked in pearls, another sign of her purity and chastity. And of course, having the black and the white not only enhances the purity of the white, also shows off that she's wearing a deep, deep black, which was the most expensive colour to have. You had to have many dyes to create a deep black, so only very rich people would wear deep black in their portraits. And of course it sets off the gold of her hair and the enormous amount of gold leaf which is put on this sword of state, sign of her justice, of her rule, and decorating beautiful rosette sort of daisies scattered all over her gown, and of course in her headdress too. Really beautiful.
And I suppose if it's all about her downstairs, seems to me always to be much more about the institution of monarchy itself.
Yes.
And that's perhaps reflected by the rather more formal and icon-like nature of the picture, do you think?
Yes, I think it's about her, this is about her governing and her justice. And she's also holding, it's very dark green, so it's not so clear until you look closely at the picture, but she's holding an olive branch, which is obviously a reference to peace. Yeah. So we not only have the purity and chastity, we also have peace. And we have the otherwise, violent image of a sword, but it's laid down, her hands aren't on it, it's beautiful and gold, and that is a sign of justice and correct rule. Yeah. And she's looking very sombre. The face is quite mask-like almost, and this is a reflection of how, as with many royal portraits, they couldn't sit every time for every portrait, so what they had was what's called a pattern or a template, and the artist would honestly just pick up the drawing pattern and use it as almost like a tracing to create their new portrait of the Queen, who was sort of ageless in her portraits. She didn't like wrinkles being painted on her face. No, not allowed. It weakened her strength as a monarch.
It's rather ironical too, the symbol of peace in her right hand. When you think 1585 is 3 years before the Spanish Armada.
Absolutely.
And 2 years before the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, when she tried to persuade Burghley to have her quietly put away rather than due process of law. And Burghley said, sorry, no, due process of law is what I believe in. Got to have a trial, however biased the trial may be, due process has got to be followed. So there are sort of ironical overtones here.
Yes.
And I was always told that this extraordinary jewel here was called the Three Brothers.
It is, yes.
Is that right? And belonged, I think, to the Dukes of Burgundy. And I have a feeling was bought by the old gangster called Guildford Dudley. It was interesting too, I suppose, as an odd connection, because he bought Hatfield from Henry VIII and then sold it on to Princess Elizabeth.
Oh, so there's an overlap
there is a sort of overlap embodied in that jewel, but that's...
Another thing to say about the jewel, and the jewels plural also on the other portraits, is that what you are actually seeing, the pearls are easy to identify, the rubies are enormously easy to identify, but what people often don't realise is that the black jewels are diamonds, because at this stage diamonds are valued for their lustre and richness, and rather than their sparkle as they are today. So they would, as you see, be cut in squares and rectangles and diamonds in very shallow, low, flat facets, rather than cut in many so that they would reflect light, and they were set on dark foil so that you'd have a black backing to the clear diamond. And so these enormous things are actually diamonds. But the pearls are more expensive than diamonds at this time, because they were obviously all not manufactured, these pearls. These are all freshwater pearls, and enormous ones at that. So that is why she has more pearls than diamonds, and that's why the diamonds are black.
I had no idea about that. Very interesting. Very interesting. The remainder of this room, as I said, it was the main reception room of the house, and of course these very elaborate fireplaces, which you see all over the house, were by a man called Maximilian Colt, who you know all about. Of course, in your main reception room, you put a suitably grand statue of your boss, King James the First and Sixth, and there he is. Well, there are all sorts of things we could talk about here, but perhaps time's come for us to go to the Long Gallery, do you think? So here we are, Emily, in the Long Gallery. It's the longest room in the house, rather self-evident. Originally, I think it was 3 rooms. There were 2 smaller rooms at each end, and at the end of the 18th century, they opened them up, which I think made these rooms slightly lighter. The ceiling is original, but Lord Salisbury of the early 19th century paid a visit to Venice, and he saw a gold ceiling there and thought, this is a bit of bling I'd rather like. So he came back and covered his own ceiling with gold leaf. And we've just finished restoring it. And I think our restorers did a great job, actually. It was beginning to look a bit tired.
No, it looks brilliant.
And they've done a terrific job. And it was a place, of course, where, particularly if it was raining, we've always been interested in politics. And it's where you conspired and walked up and down and whispered, and you could see whether there was anybody listening or not. So it was quite an important operational space.
Yes, no, I can imagine.
We might go down to the end of it and we can have a look at a couple of other things as well. So, if you think that the house was really built to entertain the king, and apart from the apartment of the builder of the house, the owner of the house, which was on that side, that was the king's wing, that was the queen's wing, and there was a small apartment here for Henry, Prince of Wales, who was the hope of the Stuart cause. Died after catching cold after a game of tennis when he was 18 years old in 1612. Altered perhaps the course of British history. But it was converted then into an extension of the Long Gallery, and there are various artefacts in it. That's always traditionally thought to be Charles I's cradle. There's absolutely no documentary evidence whatsoever to support that, but it's a family legend. And that was a present to his Lord Chamberlain in the late 18th century by George III, which was a chair made and used by Queen Anne in her coronation. She was so fat that she had to take a rest on her way up the Westminster Abbey before she sat in King Edward's chair. But I think she must have been too fat for that too. Anyway, it's been here since the late 18th century, rather splendid Baroque piece.
Splendid chair.
And then if you were slightly doubtful about how much your husband and his friends drank after dinner, after you'd left the room as Lady Salisbury, you wanted to be able to make sure they were behaving themselves, so you could look down from here. The tradition in this family is that these were Queen Elizabeth's stockings, gloves and garden hat. There's no documentary evidence for this whatsoever, just family tradition. And I think the experts would contend that although the gloves and the stockings were probably roughly contemporary, the hat itself was more likely to be 18th century. So I'm all for debunking family received wisdom if one possibly can. But anybody who has a different view, I'd very much like to hear it. Well, from the profane to the sacred, I think. We'll go and have a look at the chapel, shall we, Emily?
Yes.
We'll do it from above.
Yeah.
The chapel was consecrated, I think, a little bit later than the house was built, a couple of years later, about 1614, I think, from the records. And the top half was pretty well as built. And to me, quite interesting, because I don't think even old Burley would have got away with anything this elaborate in those rather more Puritan days, do you?
Yeah, no.
So maybe the beginning of Arminianism, and I think there is some evidence to suggest that Laud was at one point, as a very young man, part of the household.
Okay.
So that might explain a bit, perhaps.
A bit more higher church.
Absolutely. But there was this sort of journeyman painter who did a lot of decorating around here, who was responsible for the decoration, a man called Roland Bucket, not perhaps the most distinguished of artists. And he also responsible for these rather curious, what do you think, pre-Caravaggio?
Yes.
Sub.
And the roundels all around the top of this viewing gallery. I think, actually, for an English painter of the time, this was top-notch stuff. It might not have been what was being achieved by Netherlandish painters, but in terms of the English artistic output, he was up there, which I suppose is why he got such an extensive commission.
And the great glory, of course, are the windows, which are date of the house. I think they've distinguished about 3 different hands there. But they survived both the Civil War, when they were taken out and buried, and the Second World War, when there was a huge pile of sandbags when this house was a hospital. So we were lucky.
And survived, a fire that...
And the fire, you're quite right. Well, of course, the Dowager of the day in 1835 came in from hunting. She was blind, and she took a groom with her who told her when to jump. So she was quite a numero. And it's said that she knocked over a candle in her room, and she and her maid were burnt. And the whole of the house, this wing of the house, was gutted. And it stopped at the chapel, which of course the Victorians thought was a great miracle. But actually what happened was that there were some lead water tanks up on the roof which melted in the heat, put the fire out and stopped it just there. And if you go into the West Wing there, it's very Victorian. That's where we're going to make some new book rooms over the next few years. But it's quite interesting too, because you can date Oliver Twist. If you remember from the final chapters of Oliver Twist, Bill Sykes on his journey north helps put out the fire at Hatfield.
Oh.
And Dickens was one of the reporters sent down to report on the fire.
That's amazing.
So
wow.
There's rather a nice connection. So this is what we call the winter dining room, and it was originally 2 rooms and part of the Henry the Prince of Wales apartment. And they made it into 1 room in the 18th century, and then obviously mucked it around in the 19th, moved that fireplace from next door. And they also made a room into 2 rooms into 1. And these tapestries, there's an agreeable argument at the moment about where they were made. They were traditionally by Ralph Sheldon of Warwickshire.
Yeah.
But there is a theory now that they were made in London.
Mortlake?
Possibly pre-Mortlake. Anyway, they're about 1610, date of the house, and they were made for the Tracy family in Gloucestershire, who went bust in the 19th century. And my ancestor bought them, which is a great buy.
Wow.
The ladies upstairs, our great restoration ladies, spent 17 years repairing them. They did a terrific job.
Well, they're very precious things, and also tapestries used to be, and still are, incredibly expensive, because it took a lot of manpower, a lot of material, a lot of time, a lot of space to create things like this. And you had to have the design. It's not just a drawing. You then had to actually make the thing. Yeah. And they often sewed in with precious materials too, like silver, gold thread. So in themselves, they were so much more expensive than paintings were. And they also were more likely to decorate big rooms like this in historic houses. Nowadays, we think pictures all covering the walls, but actually then more tapestries, more hangings, and fewer pictures.
Well, that was true here, certainly. And there were great sets of tapestries, commissioned for this house by the builder of this house. And he had special, much grander ones for the King's visit, which were taken down afterwards.
Yes.
But I suppose in terms of bangs for your buck, you covered more wall, didn't you?
Yes, and also in terms of warmth and draft, they were sort of very practical as well as aesthetically beautiful. And you got a lot of bang for your buck in terms of wall coverage. Yes. And so if you were cunning and got yourself a very good set, that will sort you out. Yeah. You could still hang pictures on them as you have done downstairs. And I think people don't realise that nowadays, that it wasn't that unusual to hang a picture on a fabric as we do today.
Yes. Yeah. So this was originally 2 rooms. It's obviously now the main library of the house. And they made it into 1 room in the 18th century and then again mucked it around in the 19th. Another Maximilian Colt fireplace with a Venetian mosaic version of a standard picture of the builder of this house. Thomas Wotton was ambassador to Venice, and he sent him a picture which Thomas Wotton copied, or had copies by the Venetian mosaicists. And we sometimes use this for when the house is open to the public. We use some of these cases for exhibitions, and of course the great treasure of this house is the archive, and to a lesser extent the books. And some years ago we digitised the first 30,000 Elizabethan documents, and we've got a long way to go. But to give you an example of the sort of thing, perhaps the most dramatic example of these many tens of thousands of documents, is the first draft of the execution warrant of Mary Queen of Scots. So Emily, there it is.
Wow.
And he was like the great late Lord Bridges, who was always said to be able to dictate a government white paper, and you never needed to alter a jot or a tittle of it after he dictated it. Burghley was that sort of bureaucrat, and he very rarely needed to rewrite what he'd written. But you can tell the strain that he was under in this tremendous crisis of the reign and having to persuade the Queen to sign the execution warrant. If you remember the Royal Trades Union, you didn't kill each other. They might do it to you. So you can see he tried various drafts and scrubbed it out and altered it, and it conveys the emotion, I think, very much. There is another, I think, a second draft of this in the Lambeth Palace Library, but I think this is the first one.
So many crossings out.
Yeah. So it speaks volumes, I think. And of course, he thought after the explosion, after he'd bounced the Queen into signing it, and as soon as she signed it, he made sure that the thing was carried out before she changed her mind. She exploded, and he wouldn't talk to him for months, so he thought, oh, that's the end of my career. And he was very anxious about it. But she forgave in the end. Poor Mr. Secretary Davidson had to carry the can and go to the Tower.
It's a sad affair.
Was, but I think realpolitik made it essential that she should die. But it was interesting, of course, that she said, well, why don't you just get him killed quietly? But he was a due process man. No, you've got to have a proper trial, however biased it might have been. And he insisted on that. And so it's interesting, really, if you think about his use of Parliament, his insistence on the rule of law, all this rather anticipated 1688 and all that. And he and his son very much, I think, encapsulated the need for the practice of those things.
Being close to the document and the ink and the hand that wrote it.
Yes, exactly. And I suppose the only other thing in these groups that might be worth just, particularly because of its relevance to today, what happens when you have an independent Scotland? And immediately an independent Scotland links up with France in the old alliance. So if you're Burghley, what you have to do is you have to make sure that the person who runs Scotland is your man, and you feed him with English gold, and you use your encryption masters to send him instructions in code accompanying the gold, and you get the Queen to sign it. So this is some instructions from Burghley to Regent Murray in Scotland.
Wow. Look at that code.
Well, it has been decoded. We got it downstairs. It took quite a bit of doing.
No, I bet. I wonder if they did it themselves or they got someone to do it for them.
Well, he had a master. Did you ever read a book called The Watchers?
No.
By Stephen Orford. I strongly recommend it. It's wonderful. It's about the Burghley-Walsingham Sky network and this extraordinary system, sophisticated system of spies and single agents, double agents, triple agents. And Stephen Orford unravels it with extraordinary skill. It's remarkable.
Wow.
And this is an example of the sort of skullduggery you need to indulge in.
Yeah, it's amazing to see it itself.
So if Mrs. Sturgeon gets her way, then we'll see that sort of thing happen again, I'm sure.
Secret door to secret door.
It's the ultimate of putting something in the wrong place, this, but...
It's good when you get there. So.
Well, you've seen this before. This is the great Magus's John Dee's contribution to legitimising Queen Elizabeth I. And he, of course, was an alumnus of St John's College, Cambridge, which was really rather like the French ENA today. You tended to be, if you were part of the new Protestant settlement, the new Humanists, you tended to come from there. Burghley was there, Roger Ascham was there, all these people were there, including the Magus John Dee. And he did his bit to show that Queen Elizabeth must be a great queen because she was descended from anybody who was anybody. And this is her pedigree back to Adam. And if you were to believe John Dee, she was descended from anybody who's anybody. Plato, Aristotle, Attila the Hun, the generations of the Bible, the Caesars, the whole boiling lot.
Wow.
And it's 22 yards long, the length of a cricket pitch.
I was going to say whoever could fit on the paper, but it sounded like they extended the paper to fit the people.
I think they did.
All the way back to Adam.
So now we're going to look at the Chinese emperor's present. And then perhaps finish with the organ, do you think, Emily?
Sounds good, yes.
Should we do that?
Walk past
the Duke of Wellington by Wilkie, which I think was in the 1831 Royal Academy show.
Yeah. And George III with Hatfield House in the background.
Yes, because he came for the review of the militia during the 1800 invasion scare. You know there were lots of invasion scares. Mm-hmm. The French were going to come in anyway, and he left his picture behind.
Here we go.
Here we are.
Wow.
Well, this is a Chinese pleasure palace, which was, I think, a present from the Qianlong Emperor to George III. And the Salisbury of the day was Lord Chamberlain. And whenever George III cleared up out his attic, he said, anything here you'd like. And this was one of the things. Apparently 4 men struggled with it, bringing it down from London. They didn't want to shake it about too much on a cart. Mm-hmm. And we had the Chinese ambassador here 3 or 4 years ago. He got very overexcited about this. And he said, looked at it, he said, poem on either side of door, upside down.
So you've moved it?
So we put
Swapped
it right
around.
On his advice, yes.
Well, that's good. We can read it properly now.
Apparently. Are you good at Chinese?
Yes, very good, yes. Here we are. The main event.
And here we are, the organ. I think that it is alleged that the man who made this organ was a Dutchman called De Haan in the first decade of the 17th century. Mm-hmm. And I think our friend Roland Bucket was also responsible for the decoration.
Yeah, the grotesque sort of
exactly.
detailing.
So you'd recognise the style. Mm-hmm. And the great Noel Mander restored it for my father in, I think, the 1970s. And his line, if I remember right, was that there was a great revolution in organ technology in the latter part of the 17th century. So I think the works in here are late 17th century rather than early, because they put them back in. And then it's, of course, driven by electric power now. Mm-hmm. And we're very lucky that people are interested in it and come and play it. So it's used, as it will be, of course, this particular week, which is very exciting. So I think that's a bit of a skip through the house and bits and pieces. And thank you, Emily, so much.
Thank you very much.
For coming and for being so expert.
It's a pleasure.